The phone rang at 2:47 a.m., its shrill sound slicing through the darkness. Richard shot up in bed, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he just stared at the blinking screen, unlisted number. His gut twisted, but he didn't pick it up immediately. It could be the hospital again, or maybe just another late-night prank. But then the phone rang again. And again. It wasn't stopping. A sense of dread crept up his spine. With a heavy sigh, Richard reached for the phone. "Hello?" His voice was rough, hoarse from sleep, but beneath it was a tremor of fear. The voice on the other end of the line was deep, measured, and cold. It was his lawyer, Daniel Hayes, but Richard didn't recognize the tone. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to call at this hour. Not unless something serious was happening. "Richard," Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with urgency, "we need you here. I know it's late, but this can't wait." Richard's pulse quickened. "What's going on?" He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. "It's about Sarah. We have some things to go over regarding her inheritance. You need to come to the office, now. It's important." Richard froze. Inheritance. The word hit him like a brick. His wife, Sarah, had been in the hospital for months now, fighting a losing battle against cancer. He had been there, physically, at least at the beginning. He'd sat in those sterile hospital rooms with her, holding her hand, whispering promises of better days ahead. He had kissed her forehead every morning, pretending everything would be all right, but the truth was he was already checked out. He wasn't there emotionally. And the worst part? He knew it. The affair had started a few months after Sarah's diagnosis. At first, it had been innocent. He told himself it was just a bit of light flirting, something to take the edge off the misery of watching his wife wither away. But that innocent flirting turned into something else. He found himself making excuses not to visit Sarah, staying away longer each day, sneaking out to be with the woman who was filling the empty spaces Sarah's illness had left behind. Her name was Kate. She was vibrant, full of life, everything Sarah was not anymore. He didn't want to admit it, but it felt good to feel wanted again. To feel alive. He was just tired of being the martyr. But now, hearing Daniel's voice, his heart sank. Inheritance. Sarah's family's estate. He'd heard whispers about it but had never really paid attention. Sarah had barely mentioned it in her sickly state. She had always been so focused on surviving. But now, in the dead of night, Richard's mind spun. What did this mean? He had to go. He couldn't afford to ignore this. Not now. "All right," Richard said, his voice betraying a mix of anxiety and confusion. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up the phone, feeling his stomach churn. The faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen seemed unnaturally loud as he pulled himself out of bed. The house felt colder than usual. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as he dressed, his hands trembling as he buttoned his shirt. The weight of the decision he had made in those brief seconds after the phone call crashed down on him. It was a decision he'd made years ago, the decision to betray his wife, but tonight, it felt like a reckoning. Richard paused in the doorway of their bedroom. Sarah was still asleep, her shallow breathing coming in steady, rhythmic intervals. She looked peaceful, but that peace was deceptive. Her hair had thinned to almost nothing, and the once bright spark in her eyes had long faded. She was just a shell of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. He stood there for a long moment, just watching her, as if the weight of his guilt could somehow make him change his mind. But it didn't. He turned away and grabbed his car keys. The drive to the law office was a blur. The headlights cut through the fog that rolled in from the bay, but the world outside seemed distant, as if he were drifting in a dream. The streets were empty, the air thick with the damp of early morning. His mind was racing, torn between two worlds, the life he'd built with Sarah, and the life he had chosen with Kate. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, knuckles white. When he finally arrived at the office, Daniel was waiting for him outside, his expression grim. The lawyer was a tall man in his mid-50s, always impeccably dressed. He usually carried a look of calm professionalism, but tonight, his face was drawn, tight with some unspoken tension. "Richard," Daniel greeted him curtly, stepping forward. "Thanks for coming on such short notice. I wish the circumstances were different." "Where's Sarah's family?" Richard asked, his voice clipped. "Why am I here instead of them?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for Richard to follow him into the building. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Richard's mind was still spinning, and he struggled to grasp why all of this was happening. "Why now?" "Please, just sit down," Daniel said as they entered his office. He gestured to the leather chairs in front of his desk. Richard sat down, his gaze flickering over the neat piles of papers and the glowing screen of Daniel's computer. There was a strange feeling in the air, as if something was about to explode. He could feel it, a building pressure that made his chest tighten. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "There's no easy way to say this, Richard. But it's important that you know. The inheritance, it's not just about the money." Richard's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Daniel opened the file in front of him, pulling out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the desk toward Richard. "Sarah didn't just inherit the estate. She owns it, legally, and the terms of the will are complicated. There are certain conditions, stipulations. And you might be entitled to a share. But there's a catch." Richard reached for the envelope, his hands still shaking. He could feel his palms growing clammy as he opened it, his heart pounding in his ears. Inside, he found a letter, typed in precise, formal language. It was addressed to Sarah, but his name was written on the envelope as well. He took a deep breath, reading the first few lines. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "by now, you have likely come to understand that your inheritance is not just a matter of financial wealth. The estate in question comes with responsibilities and a series of conditions." Richard's breath caught in his throat. There was something in the tone of the letter that made his stomach flip. He continued reading, his eyes scanning the next lines, but it wasn't until he reached the end that he found the words that stopped him dead in his tracks. "However, upon your passing, if you have not met the following conditions, the estate will be forfeited to the next living relative. Richard will receive nothing. But if you fulfill the necessary requirements, the inheritance will pass on to you and your heirs." Richard felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His thoughts were spinning. The lawyer had said something about conditions, but this was something else. Something darker. He looked up at Daniel, searching for an explanation. "Next living relative?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Daniel nodded gravely. "The will specifies you as her next of kin, but only under certain circumstances. You may be left with nothing if the conditions aren't met." Richard's mind raced, the implications of the words crashing over him. What had Sarah known about this? Had she been keeping this secret all along? He looked down at the letter again, then back at Daniel. "What are the conditions?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just handed Richard another document. This one was much shorter, but it contained something that made Richard's blood run cold. It was a list of dates. All of them were tied to events in Sarah's life. And the last one was today. Richard's hands trembled as he looked at the list. His gaze flickered to Daniel's face, searching for answers. The tension in the room was unbearable. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "Richard, you need to make a decision. Fast. This inheritance could change everything, but it could also destroy you." Richard couldn't bring himself to look away from the document Daniel had handed him. His fingers shook as he traced the dates, each one a marker of some event in Sarah's life. A life he had been a part of, once, before he let his selfishness tear them apart. He glanced up at Daniel, whose face remained stoic, unreadable. "So, what exactly does this mean?" Richard asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "Why are these dates so important? Why would Sarah leave all this mess for me to sort through now?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes not meeting Richard's. He was avoiding the question, Richard noticed, but he didn't press it. "Not yet. There are conditions," Daniel began slowly, as if measuring his words. "Conditions that Sarah set out before she got too ill. Her estate was never just about the money. It was about keeping the family legacy intact. She knew she was leaving soon, and she made sure her affairs were in order. But these dates, Richard, they're tied to something much bigger than just the will." Richard felt a wave of frustration rising in him. He had been dragged into this nightmare because of an affair, because he hadn't been there when Sarah needed him. And now, with her on the brink of death, he was left to untangle the mess she'd left behind. "The inheritance, it isn't just a payout," Daniel continued, his voice cold and calculated. "It's a series of challenges. Tasks, if you will. These dates represent milestones in Sarah's life where she had to make specific choices that affect the future of her family's wealth. And you're the one who has to complete them now." Richard's head spun. Tasks? Milestones? This was insane. He had enough to deal with already, with the guilt eating him from the inside out, and now he was being tasked with some kind of treasure hunt? "Wait," Richard said, holding up a hand. "You're telling me Sarah left me a series of challenges, tasks, in order to get this inheritance? Why me? Why not her family? Why not Kate, for that matter?" Daniel's face tightened at the mention of Kate's name, but he didn't respond immediately. Richard noticed the way his jaw clenched. The lawyer clearly didn't like the idea of Richard's involvement with Kate, but that wasn't important right now. What mattered was the inheritance. The mystery Sarah had left behind. "You're the one who will inherit the estate, Richard," Daniel said, his voice suddenly stern. "But only if you can complete what she left for you. If not, the estate goes to someone else. Your share, your inheritance, will be forfeited." Richard leaned forward, his mind racing. "How do I even know if I can complete these tasks? What if I fail?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering to the papers on his desk. "The terms are clear. If you fail, you lose everything. But you might also gain something unexpected, something far more valuable than money." His voice dropped lower. "It's up to you, Richard. Whether you can finish what Sarah started." Richard's stomach churned as he absorbed the weight of Daniel's words. He had already failed Sarah once, left her when she needed him most. Now, with her on her deathbed, he was being asked to step into the very shoes he had abandoned. And the only way to secure his future, his family's future, was to complete these tasks, these milestones. The letter in his hands felt like a weight on his chest as he read through it once more. The dates, the instructions, everything seemed so cryptic, so impossible. He thought of Sarah, lying in the sterile hospital room, unable to even speak without coughing. The woman he had promised to love for better or worse. He had abandoned her. And now, he was left to clean up the mess. "All right," Richard said, his voice low, almost to himself. "I'll do it. I'll complete these tasks, whatever they are." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. I'll leave you to study the documents. The first task is marked clearly. It's for tomorrow. It's personal." Richard's stomach tightened. He didn't want to think about anything personal right now. He wanted to go home, to forget all this, but there was no escaping it. He had to see it through. Daniel pushed a second envelope toward him, one with a wax seal that Richard didn't recognize. "This is the first clue. It's time-sensitive." Richard took the envelope, his hand still trembling. The seal felt like a trap, like the moment he broke it, everything would change. The lawyer watched him carefully, but Richard didn't speak again. He stood up, walked out of the office, and made his way back to his car, the weight of the task ahead of him sinking deeper with each step. The drive back home was a blur. Richard's thoughts raced as he tried to process what he had just learned. Sarah's inheritance wasn't just about wealth or assets, it was about redemption. A test, an examination of his life, his choices, his loyalty. If he passed, he would gain everything, but if he failed, there would be no turning back. As he pulled into the driveway, Richard glanced at the house that had once been his home. The house that had been filled with laughter, with love, with memories of a time when he and Sarah were happy. Now, it was just a shell. The windows were dark, the shutters closed, as if even the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He opened the front door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar smell of old wood and dust. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. His footsteps echoed as he walked through the quiet halls. There were no sounds of Sarah's soft breathing, no faint hum of the television, no laughter. He moved to the living room and sat down on the couch, holding the sealed envelope in his hands. His fingers itched to break the seal, to see what the first task was. But a nagging sense of fear stopped him. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stared at the empty bottles. He poured himself a glass of water and gulped it down, trying to clear the fog from his mind. This wasn't just a test of his ability to navigate Sarah's inheritance, it was a test of his character. It was a test of whether he could still find his way back to the man he used to be. The man who had loved Sarah, who had vowed to stand by her side no matter what. When he finally returned to the living room, he sat down again, staring at the wax seal in front of him. He thought of Kate, of how much easier everything seemed when he was with her. She didn't require anything from him, no promises, no redemption, no tasks to complete. But deep down, Richard knew that his future didn't lie with Kate. It never had. He had lost sight of what mattered, and now, he was about to pay the price. With a deep breath, Richard cracked the seal on the envelope. He unfolded the letter inside and read the first line. Task 1, return to the place you first met Sarah. His heart skipped a beat. The place they first met? He hadn't thought about that in years. It was a small cafe, tucked away on the edge of town. He had been a young man, naive and full of hope. He had walked into that cafe and seen Sarah sitting alone, reading a book. He had struck up a conversation, and the rest was history. But now? Now, it felt like a cruel joke. How could going back to that place, reliving the past, help him complete a task? What kind of game was Sarah playing with him? Richard stood up, the letter clutched in his hand. He was exhausted. But he had no choice. He had to do this. For Sarah. For what they had, for what he had lost. He walked out the door, the cool night air hitting his face. His footsteps felt heavy as he made his way to the car, knowing that the first task had already begun. The drive to the cafe felt longer than it ever had before. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He kept glancing at the letter in the passenger seat next to him, as if the words might shift, reveal something new, or, more likely, bring him closer to the answers he so desperately needed. The cool night air, despite the windows being rolled up, seemed to close in on him, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The cafe, the Willow Tree Cafe, was a small, inconspicuous spot, tucked away on the corner of a forgotten street in the town they had once lived in. He hadn't been back there since Sarah's diagnosis. In fact, after the day they first met, their lives had changed so dramatically that the cafe had become a distant memory, a relic of a time before the illness, before his betrayal, before everything spiraled out of control. The place had held too many good memories, and that was what had made it so hard to visit. But now, It felt like the first step toward some kind of redemption, or at least a way to understand what Sarah had left behind. As Richard turned onto the street, he saw the familiar neon sign glowing softly in the distance. The Willow Tree Café. It looked exactly as he remembered it, old but charming, with ivy climbing its brick facade and a modest sign above the door. The warm yellow light spilling from the windows felt like an invitation, but also a reminder of what he had lost. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the café through the windshield. His mind swirled with memories of the past. Sarah had been so vibrant back then, so full of life. They had spent hours here, talking about their dreams, about the future. It felt so long ago, and yet, the weight of it still hung over him. The guilt. The loss. He hadn't even realized how much he missed those simpler moments until now. Taking a deep breath, Richard got out of the car and made his way to the entrance. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, just as it had all those years ago. The interior was cozy, with dark wood tables and chairs, a fireplace in the corner, and a few patrons scattered around, sipping their drinks in peaceful silence. Nothing had changed. It was as if time had stood still in this little café. But Richard wasn't here to relive the past in some nostalgic sense. He was here for a reason, a task that Sarah had set for him, one that he still didn't fully understand. Why had she sent him here? What was he supposed to find? The answer seemed impossible to uncover, but he had no choice but to try. He walked up to the counter where a middle-aged woman with short, salt and pepper hair greeted him with a friendly smile. "Hello there, what can I get you?" Richard hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was supposed to order. He wasn't here for coffee. He wasn't here for anything but the past. And yet, the woman's smile, so warm and familiar, caught him off guard. This had been their place, his and Sarah's. How many times had they sat right here, planning their lives together? How many coffees had they shared? How many conversations had they had, full of laughter, love, and promise? I'll have a coffee," Richard said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Black. Please." The woman nodded and went to prepare the coffee. Richard stood there, staring at the small tables scattered around the café. His mind drifted back to the first time he had seen Sarah sitting in one of those chairs, a book in her lap, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She had been so beautiful, so effortlessly graceful. He had been struck by how lost in the book she had been, completely unaware of him approaching. It had taken him a few tries to gather the courage to speak to her, to interrupt her world with his own. He smiled at the memory now, though it was tinged with regret. "Here you go," the woman said, snapping him out of his thoughts. She placed the coffee in front of him, her eyes studying him for a moment. "You're not from around here, are you?" Richard shook his head. "No, not for a while." She nodded. "I thought so. Been a while since I've seen you. You used to come in here with that girl of yours. Sarah, wasn't it?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear her name spoken so casually. So much of Sarah felt like it belonged to the past now, as though she were a memory fading into the background of his life. But hearing it here, in this place, made everything feel raw again. Real. It was as if Sarah's spirit lingered in the air, in the scent of the coffee, in the quiet hum of the café. "That's right," Richard said softly, his voice betraying a hint of emotion. "Sarah." The woman's eyes softened. "She's been gone for a while now, hasn't she?" Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. His throat tightened as memories of Sarah's illness came rushing back, the pain, the hospital visits, the endless days filled with false hope. The weight of it all felt like it might suffocate him. "I'm sorry," she said gently, her expression sincere. "She was a lovely girl. You two had something special." Richard's eyes burned, but he forced a smile. Yeah, we did. He took a sip of the coffee, but it tasted bitter on his tongue. It wasn't just the coffee, it was the ache in his chest, the deep sense of loss that never truly went away. He looked down at the table, then back at the woman. "I'm not here for a drink," he said, his voice low. "I'm here because of something else. Something from the past." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Oh?" Richard's hand trembled slightly as he set his coffee cup down. "I was given a task. A test, you could say. And it led me here. To this cafe. I need to know if you remember something." The woman's gaze sharpened. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "What is it you need to know?" Richard hesitated. What was he really hoping to find? Was there a clue here, something hidden in the walls of this cafe that would make sense of the mysterious task Sarah had left him? He glanced at the small table where he and Sarah had spent so many hours, the very place they had shared their first conversation. "Do you remember, the first time Sarah and I came here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The first time we met?" The woman nodded slowly, a faint smile touching her lips. "Of course I do. You two were so nervous, like you didn't know how to start. But you ended up talking for hours. You both left with smiles on your faces, and I remember thinking, this is it. You were meant to be." Richard swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. The memories of that day rushed in, overwhelming him. It was hard to imagine the carefree, innocent versions of themselves, the versions of him and Sarah who had believed love could conquer anything. "I don't suppose you still have the journal we left behind, do you?" Richard asked suddenly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. It was a small, leather-bound book. "We used to write in it together." The woman stared at him, her expression shifting as she took in what he was asking. For a moment, Richard thought she was going to laugh or tell him it was all a silly memory. But instead, she looked around the cafe, her eyes lingering on the shelves in the corner. "I might still have it," she said softly. "But I don't know, it's been years. I'll have a look." Richard sat back, the uncertainty gnawing at him. What could the journal have to do with his task? Why would Sarah's first task involve something so trivial? But he had no answers. All he had were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. The woman returned a few minutes later, holding a small leather journal in her hands. She placed it on the table in front of Richard, her fingers tracing its surface before she looked up at him. "Here it is. I wasn't sure, but it's yours, right?" Richard's breath caught in his throat as he took the journal from her. It was old, worn, the leather cracked and faded, but there it was, his journal. The one he and Sarah had written in together. A record of their early days. Of their dreams. Of their love. He opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The ink had faded, but there were still traces of their handwriting, Sarah's neat script and his more hurried scrawl. He flipped through the pages, feeling the weight of their shared history. And then, toward the back, he found it. The last entry. It was written in Sarah's handwriting, but the words felt strange, almost cryptic. "Sometimes, the hardest things in life are the ones we don't want to face. But we must. Always." Richard's heart pounded. What did it mean? What had Sarah known? What was she trying to tell him? He closed the journal and looked up at the woman, who was watching him closely. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled, though there was something wistful in her gaze. "You're welcome. Take care of yourself, Richard." As he left the cafe, the journal clutched tightly in his hands, he knew one thing for certain, this task was far from over. The past had come back to haunt him in ways he hadn't expected. And the answers he sought were just beginning to reveal themselves. But what had Sarah meant by those final words? And how would they change everything? The drive home from the cafe felt strangely silent. Richard's hand still clutched the small leather journal, the pages of which seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. He hadn't been expecting to find the journal, much less the cryptic last entry from Sarah. The words, written in her neat handwriting, echoed in his mind as he drove, their meaning eluding him. Sometimes, the hardest things in life are the ones we don't want to face. But we must. Always. What was she trying to tell him? What did she know that he didn't? And how did this cryptic message fit into the task that Daniel had assigned him? Richard's mind raced as he pulled into his driveway. He didn't want to go inside. He didn't want to face the empty house, the reminders of everything he had lost. But there was no avoiding it. Not anymore. He got out of the car, still holding the journal. The weight of it felt like a constant pull, like something buried deep inside him, waiting to be uncovered. He walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The house was just as empty as it had been when he left. The silence pressed down on him, suffocating. There were no footsteps, no sound of Sarah's voice, no hint of the life they once had. The walls felt hollow, like they were holding their breath, waiting for something. Richard went straight to the living room and dropped the journal on the coffee table. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't concentrate on anything. His thoughts kept circling back to that last entry from Sarah. It was as if she had known something he didn't, something that he had to figure out. But what was it? He opened the journal again, flipping through the familiar pages, searching for something, anything, that would help him make sense of her words. There was nothing else cryptic. It was all memories. Moments they had shared. Pages filled with dreams and hopes for the future that now seemed painfully out of reach. Frustrated, Richard slammed the journal shut and stood up, pacing the room. He needed answers. He needed to know what Sarah had meant. He had no idea how to start, but he had to try. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping him out of his spiral of thoughts. He picked it up, seeing a message from Daniel. "I trust you've completed your first task. You need to come back to the office. We have something important to discuss." Richard frowned. He hadn't expected this so soon. The task had only just begun, but he knew he couldn't put it off. If Daniel had something else to reveal, he had to know what it was. But what if this new information only made things more complicated? Without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and left the house. As he drove back to Daniel's office, the weight of the journal in his bag felt like a constant reminder of the task that still loomed over him. He still didn't fully understand what Sarah was asking of him, but every step he took seemed to pull him deeper into a mystery that was beginning to feel suffocating. Daniel's office was quiet when Richard arrived. The lights were dim, and the air felt thick with anticipation. Daniel was already waiting for him, sitting behind his desk with a stack of papers in front of him. His expression was serious, almost grim. "Sit down," Daniel said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "We need to talk." Richard hesitated for a moment, glancing at the papers on the desk, but then he sat down. "What's going on?" he asked. "What's this about?" Daniel folded his hands in front of him and took a deep breath. "We've been monitoring the situation with your wife's estate, and there's something you need to know. Something that might change everything." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's going on with the estate?" Daniel didn't immediately answer. Instead, he slid one of the papers across the desk to Richard. "This is a letter," he said quietly. "A letter Sarah left for you, but it wasn't in the will. It was separate. Hidden." Richard stared at the paper in front of him. He recognized Sarah's handwriting on the envelope, but this letter didn't feel like a part of the inheritance that had been left for him. This felt different, more personal, more intimate. He picked up the letter, his fingers trembling. He slid the paper from the envelope and began to read. "Richard, I don't have much time to explain, and I'm sorry for the way things turned out. But there are things you need to understand, things that I couldn't tell you before. There are secrets that I've kept from you, things that will change everything about what you think you know. If you want to know the truth about my illness, about the estate, and about why I did what I did, you need to go to the place where it all began. The place you've been avoiding. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The place you've been avoiding. What did that mean? He had no idea what Sarah was referring to, but he knew this letter was important. He kept reading. I'm leaving you this because you deserve to know. I never wanted to hurt you, but the choices I made were for reasons you couldn't understand at the time. The truth is, there was always more to the inheritance than you knew. The money wasn't the only thing at stake, it was never about the money. It was about what I left behind. You need to go to the old cabin by the lake. The one we always talked about escaping to. There, you'll find the final piece of the puzzle. But you have to be prepared. The truth isn't easy, Richard. But it's the only way forward. Sarah. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as he finished reading. His hands shook, and his throat constricted. The old cabin by the lake. They had talked about it once, long ago, when they were still dreaming of a future that felt endless. It was a place they had both imagined escaping to, just the two of them, away from the world, away from the pain. But he hadn't thought about that place in years. Not since everything had started to fall apart. The letter was clear, though. This was where he had to go. The cabin. But what could Sarah have meant by the final piece of the puzzle? What could be waiting for him there? Daniel's voice broke through Richard's thoughts. You have to understand, Richard. This letter changes everything. Sarah didn't just leave you a test of inheritance. She left you a trail to uncover the truth. There are things she kept from you, things about her illness, about why she pushed you away. You need to face what's there. If you don't, you might lose more than you ever imagined. Richard's mind raced. This was the moment. The moment where everything would either be revealed or lost forever. He couldn't keep running from the past. He couldn't keep pretending that he didn't know the truth. He stood up suddenly, the letter still clutched in his hand. I have to go, he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. I have to go to the cabin. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. It's your choice, Richard. But remember, once you go there, there's no turning back. Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was already halfway out the door, already heading toward the truth, toward whatever awaited him at the cabin. As he drove toward the lake, the weight of Sarah's words hung over him like a shroud. The final piece of the puzzle. The truth. He had no idea what he would find, but he knew one thing for sure, nothing would ever be the same again. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as he drove through the winding road that led to the lake. The journey felt endless, as though every mile added more weight to his shoulders, pressing down on him with the weight of anticipation, guilt, and fear. His thoughts circled like vultures around the letter Sarah had left for him. The final piece of the puzzle, she had written, the words echoing in his mind, making his pulse quicken with every passing second. What could it possibly mean? The drive had taken longer than he expected. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. As he passed a dense thicket of trees, he remembered how Sarah had once told him the lake was a place for healing, a refuge from the world's chaos. They had planned to buy a cabin there, to escape from everything, from the noise, from the expectations, from life. But that was before her illness. Before everything spiraled into a nightmare. He hadn't been back to the lake since she had passed. It was a place of too many memories, too much loss. The cabin they had once dreamed of was now a symbol of what they would never have. He didn't even know if it was still there. He turned off the main road and onto a narrow gravel path, his tires kicking up dust as he made his way deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the air heavier with the scent of pine and earth. His heart began to race. He could feel it in his chest, this was it. He was on the edge of something, but he had no idea what awaited him. He had no idea what truth Sarah had hidden in that cabin, or what he was about to uncover. After what seemed like an eternity, the trees parted, revealing the lake. The sight of it took his breath away, the vast, serene water stretched out before him, glistening under the fading light of the sun. He could almost hear Sarah's voice in his mind, the way she had described the place with such fondness, as though it were a sanctuary. For a moment, he almost felt her presence there, like a whisper in the wind. But then the moment passed, and reality set in again. The cabin was just ahead, nestled on the edge of the lake, hidden behind a grove of trees. It looked the same, but older. The wood had faded, the roof sagged slightly under the weight of time. It was a shadow of the dream they had once shared. Richard parked the car and got out, his legs feeling unsteady as he approached the cabin. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, and the door groaned in protest when he pushed it open. The smell of mildew and dust hit him immediately. The cabin had been abandoned for years. Yet, despite its decaying condition, it still felt familiar, too familiar. This was where their dreams had lived, and now it felt like a tomb for all the things they had lost. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The space was small but cozy. A fireplace dominated one wall, the hearth cold and unused. The large windows offered a view of the lake, the water shimmering in the last light of day. It looked almost peaceful, but the air in the room felt thick with unresolved emotions, memories that hadn't been allowed to breathe for years. Richard moved through the cabin slowly, touching things as he went. The couch where they had once sat together, the bookshelf where Sarah had kept her favorite novels, the small kitchen that had once been filled with laughter and the smell of meals shared. Every object seemed to carry the weight of their lost future. He made his way to the back of the cabin, to the small room they had intended to make into a study. It had been empty when they left, but Sarah had always said it would be the place for their plans, their dreams. He remembered her talking about how it would be their creative space, where they would build their life together. But life had other plans. As Richard approached the back room, he noticed something odd. A piece of the floor was uneven, a small section of wood that seemed to have been lifted recently. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as he pried it up. Beneath it, there was a small, hidden compartment. His heart skipped a beat. Inside the compartment was a small, weathered box, its edges worn and chipped. Richard's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This had to be what Sarah had meant by the final piece of the puzzle. He lifted the box carefully, almost afraid to disturb whatever was inside. The wood creaked as he opened it, revealing a stack of letters, yellowed with age. At the top of the pile was an envelope with his name written in Sarah's handwriting. Richard's hands shook as he pulled it out, his mind racing. He ripped the envelope open, and the first letter fell into his hands. It was addressed to him, but there was no date. It began simply. Richard. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have said a long time ago, but I couldn't. I was too afraid. Too proud. But now I don't have that luxury, and neither do you. The truth is, I made a choice I thought was for the best. But I can't pretend anymore that it didn't hurt us both. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't stop reading. I know what you're going through right now, and I know you'll never forgive me for what I've done. But you have to understand, this wasn't about you or me, it was about something bigger. There is something about our past that I hid from you, something that I couldn't share because it would have torn everything apart. But I need you to know, Richard. I need you to understand why I made the choices I did. The inheritance, it's not just about money. It's about power, legacy, and the kind of future we could have had. But I made a mistake. And you're the one who has to fix it. Sarah. Richard dropped the letter into his lap, his hands trembling. The words blurred before his eyes, but he forced himself to focus. What was Sarah talking about? Power, Legacy? It didn't make sense. She had never talked about anything like that before. She had always been so focused on their life together, their future, not some grand scheme of inheritance or power. He pulled out another letter, this one dated a few months before her death. His breath caught as he read it. Richard. I know you've been struggling with the truth. I know you've been asking yourself why I pushed you away. But the answer is simple, I had no choice. There were people watching us, people who wanted to take everything from us. I tried to protect you, but in the end, I couldn't. I couldn't protect you from the truth. The inheritance, it's not just money. It's a key, Richard. A key to something much larger, something dangerous. And now, it's your turn to decide if you want to open that door. I'm sorry I couldn't explain it all before. But I need you to understand that this is bigger than both of us. The choices we make now will affect everything. And I trust you, Richard. I trust you to do what's right. Sarah. Richard felt his blood run cold as he read the last words. A key. To something dangerous. Was Sarah trying to warn him? What was she talking about? The inheritance, what was it? What had she gotten involved in that was so dangerous? The air in the cabin grew heavy, suffocating. Richard's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. There were still more letters in the box, but his head was spinning, his thoughts muddled. One thing was certain, Sarah had been involved in something far darker than he had ever imagined. And now, it was up to him to uncover the rest of the truth. He stood up abruptly, his heart hammering in his chest. This was only the beginning. He had no idea what he was about to uncover, but one thing was clear, he had been thrust into a world he was unprepared for, and there was no turning back now. He grabbed the stack of letters, stuffing them into his bag, and walked out of the cabin. The lake stretched before him, peaceful and serene, but Richard knew better now. Nothing was as it seemed. The truth was waiting to be uncovered, and it was darker than he had ever imagined. Richard had driven back to the city with a sense of dread heavy in his chest. He hadn't spoken a word since he left the cabin, the weight of Sarah's letters pressing on him like a 100-pound stone. The mystery was no longer just about the inheritance, it was about survival, deception, and betrayal. As he made his way through the streets, his thoughts were spinning in a cyclone of confusion and fear. What had Sarah been involved in? What was this key she mentioned, and why had she left him to uncover it? The further he drove, the more questions filled his mind, and the clearer it became that the truth wasn't going to come easily. The inheritance wasn't just a gift, it was a curse, a gateway to something far darker than he had ever anticipated. And now, it was up to him to face it. When he pulled into his driveway, Richard felt the same emptiness from earlier, the same coldness of the house that no longer felt like home. The house where Sarah's laughter had once filled the rooms, where their plans for the future had been made. Now, it was just an echo of a life that could never be. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the front door, but he knew he couldn't hide from this any longer. He had to keep moving forward. He had to uncover the rest of Sarah's story, the rest of what had happened. There was no turning back. Richard walked into the house, his steps slow but deliberate. He went straight to the study where the letters were now scattered on the desk. His mind was racing, but he couldn't concentrate. The words Sarah had written were still ringing in his ears. The inheritance isn't just money. It's a key. A key to what? To power? To something bigger than he could comprehend? He opened the final letter in the pile, one he hadn't yet read. It was marked with a strange symbol, a series of lines and circles drawn together in an intricate design. Richard felt his heart beat faster as he unfolded the letter, dreading what it might reveal. It was short, the words to the point. Richard. You have come this far. You've uncovered pieces of the puzzle, but now it's time to face the truth. The inheritance was never meant to be just money. It's a legacy, a responsibility, and a key to a legacy much older than you could imagine. There are people who will do anything to get what's hidden within it, and you must make a choice. You can walk away and leave it all behind, or you can face the darkness that comes with it. This key, this inheritance, has been passed down through generations. It's a part of something much bigger. But now it's your turn to decide. The choice is yours. Sarah. Richard felt a chill spread through him as he reread the letter. He could no longer ignore it. The legacy wasn't just about money. It wasn't about Sarah's illness or the life they had planned together. It was something much more sinister. Something deeply rooted in the past. He knew now that his involvement in this wasn't a coincidence. He had been brought into something larger, something connected to people who would stop at nothing to control it. But what was it? What did Sarah leave him to protect? Suddenly, his phone rang, breaking his trance. Richard picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a call from an unknown number. "Hello?" he answered, his voice tight. "Richard?" The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper, but there was no mistaking the urgency. "I know what you're looking for. And I need you to listen carefully." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" "It's someone who can help. But you have to meet me. There's no time to waste. You need to get to the old warehouse on 4th Street. It's now or never." The line went dead before Richard could ask anything more. His mind was spinning. A warehouse? 4th Street? The urgency in the voice told him that this was a lead, one that could finally give him the answers he needed. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and left the house. He didn't know who had called, but he knew that he couldn't waste time. If there was one last chance to uncover the truth about Sarah's inheritance, he had to take it. The warehouse stood in a forgotten part of the city, abandoned and silent, its windows shattered and covered in grime. The building loomed like a shadow against the darkening sky, an eerie reminder of everything Richard had tried to forget. He parked the car a few blocks away and approached on foot, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he couldn't. Not now. As he approached the entrance, he saw a shadow move inside the darkened warehouse. He stepped cautiously inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the broken windows. His heart raced as he moved deeper into the building, the scent of mildew and decay filling the air. "Richard," a voice called out from the darkness. Richard froze. "Over here." He followed the sound of the voice, his pulse quickening. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a black jacket, his face obscured by the darkness. "I know you're looking for the key," the man said, his voice cold and distant. "But you don't understand what you're really dealing with. The inheritance is just a small part of something much bigger. And now, it's too late for you to back out." Richard's mind raced. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What's this all about? What does Sarah have to do with all of this?" The man stepped into the light, revealing his face. Richard gasped as he recognized him, a figure from his past. It was Daniel, the same man who had given him the task, the one who had guided him through the maze of his wife's estate. "You?" Richard stammered. "You're the one behind all of this?" Daniel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm the one who has been keeping the legacy alive. And now it's time for you to make a choice, Richard. You've come this far, but you don't know what you're about to unleash." Richard felt his chest tighten. "What are you talking about? What legacy?" Daniel sighed, as if he were disappointed in Richard's ignorance. "Sarah was never just a sick woman. She was part of something ancient. Something that stretches back centuries. The inheritance was meant to continue a legacy of power, influence, and control. And now it's your turn to either accept it or destroy it." Richard's head spun. This was too much to process. He had thought Sarah had left him the inheritance as a way to honor their life together, but now he was being told it was a key to something far darker. What had she gotten herself into? What had he been dragged into? You have two choices, Daniel continued. You can take the legacy, use the power that comes with it, or you can destroy it. But if you destroy it, you risk everything. There are people who will stop at nothing to protect what Sarah has left behind. And they won't hesitate to take you down if you try to destroy it. Richard's mind was reeling. This was a choice he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about Sarah's death or her illness. It was about a legacy that had been passed down through generations, a legacy of power and control. The weight of it crushed him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to make that decision. Daniel stepped closer. The choice is yours, Richard. But remember, once you choose, there's no turning back. For the first time, Richard felt the full weight of what Sarah had left him. The inheritance wasn't just money, and it wasn't just about her memory. It was about something far darker, something he had never imagined. And now, it was up to him to decide whether he would embrace it or destroy it. The silence between them was thick with tension. Richard could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This was the moment that would shape everything. He looked at Daniel, then back at the shadows surrounding them. The future of the legacy was in his hands. And in that moment, Richard made his choice.